The key turned in the lock with a sound like breaking bones. I stood on the porch of 1247 Elm Street, my hand trembling as I pushed open the door that hadn't been opened in 15 years. The hinges screamed in protest, releasing a gust of stale air that tasted of dust, decay, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. My Aunt Clara had been dead for 3 weeks before anyone found her. The neighbors eventually called the police when her mail started overflowing, and they discovered her body in the kitchen, collapsed beside a half-finished cup of tea that had grown a film of mold. The coroner said natural causes, a heart attack, sudden and merciful. But nothing about inheriting her house felt merciful. I'd barely known Clara. She was my father's sister, the one who'd disappeared from family gatherings after some unspoken tragedy in the early 2000s. Dad would go quiet whenever her name came up, would change the subject with the practiced ease of someone who'd been avoiding uncomfortable truths for decades. All I knew was that she'd been married once, briefly, and that something terrible had happened to her family. Now I stood in the doorway of her house, breathing in the smell of 15 years of solitude, holding the deed that made me the owner of a property I'd never wanted. The realtor had been blunt about the situation. "It's been on the market 3 times, she'd said, her manicured fingers tapping against her tablet. "The price keeps dropping, but, well, people have concerns about the history." I'd pressed her for details, but she'd only mentioned local superstitions and unfortunate incidents. Small-town gossip, I'd assumed. The kind of stories that grew in the telling until a simple tragedy became something much darker. The house was a 2-story Victorian, painted white with green shutters that had faded to the color of old copper. It sat on a large lot surrounded by maple trees that blocked most of the afternoon sun, casting the property in perpetual shadow. From the outside, it looked like any other century-old house. Charming, if a bit neglected. But standing in the doorway, I could feel something wrong about the place, something that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't explain. The front hallway stretched toward a staircase that curved up into darkness. To my left, a parlor filled with furniture covered in white sheets. To my right, a dining room with a table set for 4, as if Clara had been expecting guests who never arrived. The wallpaper was faded roses, once cheerful but now looking like bloodstains against the yellowed background. I forced myself to step inside, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click, and suddenly the house felt different, smaller, more intimate, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The living room was a museum of abandoned life. Newspapers from 2009 were stacked on the coffee table, their headlines screaming about financial crises and wars that seemed distant now. Photographs lined the mantelpiece. Clara, as a young woman, radiant in a wedding dress. The same woman holding a baby, her smile bright with new motherhood. Family portraits that included faces I didn't recognize, all of them looking slightly out of focus, as if the camera had been unable to capture them clearly. I picked up one of the photographs, a family portrait that must have been taken in this very room. Clara stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. In front of them were 2 children, a boy and a girl maybe 8 and 10 years old. They all looked happy, genuinely happy, in the way that people rarely do in formal portraits. But something was wrong with the image. The longer I stared at it, the more unsettled I became. The children's faces seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if they were moving just outside my peripheral vision. The glass had a crack running through it, distorting their features in ways that made them look wrong. I set the photograph down quickly, my hands shaking. Stress, I told myself. Grief over a relative I'd barely known, anxiety about inheriting a house I couldn't afford to maintain, normal reactions to an abnormal situation. But as I walked through the rest of the house, that feeling of wrongness only grew stronger. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the tea Clara had been making when she died. The bedrooms upstairs were filled with clothes that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-wear. A child's school uniform laid out on a bed, a man's work clothes draped over a chair. Everything preserved exactly as it had been left, as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary day. In the master bedroom, I found Clara's journal, left open on the nightstand. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death. They're getting louder. The voices in the walls, the footsteps in the hallway. I know they're not real, but knowing doesn't make them stop. Dr. Peterson says it's grief, that trauma can manifest in auditory hallucinations. But I hear them, calling my name. And they sound so much like James and the children that sometimes I answer back. I should have left this house years ago. Should have sold it when the offers were still good, before the stories started spreading. But how can I leave when they're still here? How can I abandon them when they need me to remember? The anniversary is coming up again. 15 years since the accident. 15 years since I lost everything that mattered. Maybe this time I'll finally have the courage to join them. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The accident. That was what Dad had never talked about. Clara had lost her family in some kind of accident, and the grief had driven her to live as a hermit in this house for 15 years, slowly losing her mind to memories and guilt. It was sad, but it was also explainable, tragic, but human. The kind of story that played out in countless homes across the country, families destroyed by sudden loss, survivors who never quite learned how to live again. But as I walked back downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide movement. Every creak of the settling house sounded like footsteps. The family photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to track my movement across the room, their faces shifting in ways that made my vision blur. I was being ridiculous. The house was empty, had been empty for weeks. Whatever Clara had heard in her final years, whatever had driven her to write those desperate journal entries, it was the product of a grieving mind, not supernatural activity. But when I reached the front door, ready to leave and never come back, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. Children's laughter echoing from somewhere upstairs, high and bright and joyful, the sound of kids playing a game they found endlessly entertaining. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to the impossible sound of happiness in a house that had been empty for decades. The laughter continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded into silence so complete it hurt my ears. I should have left then, should have walked out that door, driven back to my apartment, and called the realtor to put the house on the market immediately. Instead, I found myself climbing the stairs, drawn by something I couldn't name, toward whatever was waiting in the darkness above. The laughter had stopped, but I could still hear something, a whispered conversation too quiet to make out words, but distinct enough to know it was coming from the children's bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of afternoon light that seemed dimmer than it should have been. I pushed the door open and found the room exactly as I'd left it, empty except for toys and furniture that hadn't been disturbed in 15 years. But the air felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. And on the floor, in the thin layer of dust that covered everything, I could see footprints, small ones, the size a child might make, leading from the bed to the window and back again. Fresh footprints in a room that had been sealed for 15 years. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs, and nearly tripped over something that hadn't been there before. A toy truck, bright red and obviously well-loved, sitting in the middle of the hallway. It was warm to the touch, as if someone had just been playing with it. That's when I ran, down the stairs, through the hallway, and out the front door without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. But as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the family photograph and the way the children's faces had seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And I couldn't forget the sound of their laughter, so alive and joyful in a house that had known nothing but grief for 15 years. I would have to come back. The house was mine now for better or worse, and I couldn't just abandon it. But next time, I wouldn't come alone. The Millbrook Public Library smelled like old paper and fluorescent lights, a combination that usually comforted me but now felt oppressive. I'd spent the morning searching through newspaper archives, looking for any mention of the accident Clara had referenced in her journal. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and knowing eyes, had been helpful in ways that suggested she'd fielded similar requests before. "You're asking about the Hendricks family," she said, not making it a question. "Clara's people. That was a terrible thing, what happened to them." She led me to a microfilm machine in the back corner, away from the other patrons. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone handling explosives. "The records are all here if you really want to see them, but I have to ask, are you sure you want to know? Sometimes the past is better left buried." I thought about the toy truck, warm in my hands, and the footprints in the dust. "I need to know," I said. The first article was dated October 15, 2009. The headline read, "Local family dies in house fire. Mother survives." The photograph accompanying the story showed the house at 1247 Elm Street, but it looked wrong. The windows were boarded up, the white paint scorched black, the roof partially collapsed. It took me a moment to realize I was looking at the same house I'd visited the day before. But this version was burned and broken, a skeleton of what it used to be. The article told a story that made my stomach turn. James Hendricks, 34, had been working late in his home office when an electrical fire started in the basement. The flames spread quickly through the old house, filling the upper floors with smoke before anyone realized what was happening. By the time the fire department arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. They found James in the hallway outside his children's bedroom, apparently trying to reach them when the smoke overcame him. 8-year-old Michael and 10-year-old Sarah were discovered in their beds, victims of smoke inhalation. All three were pronounced dead at the scene. Clara had been at her sister's house that night, helping care for their mother who was recovering from surgery. She'd returned home to find her house burning and her family already gone. The photograph showed her standing across the street, still in her pajamas, watching firefighters carry covered stretchers from the ruins of her life. The follow-up articles were even more disturbing. The fire investigation revealed that the electrical system had been faulty for years, a hazard that should have been obvious to anyone who'd bothered to look. The insurance company initially refused to pay out, suggesting negligence on the family's part. Clara fought them for months, spending her savings on lawyers and investigators, trying to prove that the fire wasn't her fault. But the most unsettling detail came in an article from 6 months later. Clara had hired contractors to rebuild the house, insisting on restoring it exactly as it had been before the fire. The workers reported strange incidents, tools going missing, electrical problems that couldn't be explained, and the sound of children playing in rooms that were still just bare studs and insulation. 3 different contractors quit the job before it was finished. One of them, a man named Rodriguez, gave an interview to the local paper that made my hands shake as I read it. "It wasn't natural what was happening in that house," he said. "You'd be working in one room and hear footsteps in another, but when you went to check, nobody was there. Power tools would turn on by themselves. We'd find our ladders moved to different positions overnight, always set up like someone was trying to reach something high up. Maybe a child's toy or a book on a shelf." But the worst part was the voices. Kids laughing, playing hide and seek, calling for their mother. Clear as day, like they were right there in the room with you. My guys started refusing to work there. said it felt like the dead were watching everything we did. Clara had eventually found a contractor willing to finish the job, but only after agreeing to pay triple the normal rate. The house was completed in 2011, restored to its exact original condition, but Clara never invited anyone over, never had guests or parties. She lived alone in a house built for a family that no longer existed. The final article I found was from 2015, a human interest piece about local residents who'd faced tragedy and rebuilt their lives. The reporter had tried to interview Clara, but she'd refused to speak to the press. The article mentioned that neighbors rarely saw her except when she was tending to her garden or collecting mail. Children in the neighborhood had started telling stories about the sad lady who lived in the house where the family had died, claiming they could sometimes see figures in the windows, even though everyone knew Clara lived alone. I sat back in the uncomfortable library chair, my mind racing. The house I'd inherited wasn't just the site of a tragedy, it was a recreation of the tragedy, rebuilt exactly as it had been when the fire claimed 3 lives. And according to multiple witnesses, something had been trying to communicate during the reconstruction. Something that sounded like children at play. Find what you were looking for? The librarian's voice made me jump. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find anything else. Do you know if anyone else has been asking about the Hendricks family recently? Her expression grew carefully neutral. Occasionally, real estate agents mostly when they're trying to sell the house, insurance investigators a few times over the years, and there was a paranormal research group that came through about 5 years ago, but Clara wouldn't let them on the property. Paranormal research? Ghost hunters, they called themselves, had all kinds of electronic equipment, claimed they could detect supernatural activity. The police had to escort them off Clara's property when she threatened to call the sheriff. She paused, studying my face. You're not thinking of living in that house, are you? I inherited it, I said. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it yet. The librarian was quiet for a long moment, then leaned closer. My grandmother used to live on that street, she said softly. She passed 10 years ago, but she told me stories about that house. Said Clara talked to empty rooms like people were listening. Said she set the table for 4 every night, even though she was eating alone. Grief can do strange things to people, I said, but even as I spoke the words, I was thinking about the worn toy truck and the footprints in the dust. Maybe, the librarian said, but my grandmother also said she'd seen lights in the children's bedrooms sometimes at night when Clara was downstairs watching television. And she swore she'd heard children's voices in the backyard, even though Clara never had visitors. I thanked her and left the library, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd learned more than I wanted to know. The house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something that had been trying to communicate for 15 years. Something that had driven Clara to live as a hermit and set tables for a family that no longer existed. But knowing the history didn't change my situation. I still owned the house, still needed to decide what to do with it. And despite everything I'd learned, despite the rational part of my brain that screamed at me to sell the property and never look back, I found myself driving toward Elm Street instead of home. There were questions that needed answers, and the only way to get them was to spend more time in the house. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. Dr. Sarah Chen had been my psychology professor in college, the kind of teacher who made you question everything you thought you knew about the human mind. She specialized in trauma and grief, with a particular interest in how people process loss and adapt to life-changing events. When I called her about Clara's house, she'd been intrigued enough to drive down from the university. Grief hallucinations are more common than people realize, she explained as we sat in her car outside 1247 Elm Street, especially in cases of sudden, traumatic loss. The mind creates sensory experiences to fill the void left by the deceased. Your aunt hearing her children's voices, seeing movement in empty rooms. It's all consistent with complicated grief disorder. Always. I appreciated her clinical perspective, but I hadn't told her everything. The warm toy truck, the fresh footprints, the way the photographs seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, those details seemed too absurd to share with someone who dealt in facts and evidence. But you mentioned that contractors reported similar experiences. She continued, flipping through her notebook. That's more unusual. Grief hallucinations typically don't transfer to people who didn't know the deceased. That's why I wanted you to see the house, I said. I need to know if what I'm experiencing is psychological or if there's something else going on. Dr. Chen nodded, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She was humoring me, treating this as a case study in how grief and suggestion could create false perceptions. But she was also curious enough to want to document the experience, to see how the environment might influence someone who is already emotionally vulnerable. We approached the house together, and I was relieved to find that it looked normal in the afternoon sunlight. The shadows seemed less oppressive, the windows less like watching eyes. Maybe having someone else with me would break whatever spell the place had cast over my imagination. The key turned easily this time, and the door opened without the bone-muttering sound I remembered from the day before. Dr. Chen stepped inside first, her trained eye taking in the details I'd missed. The precision with which everything had been arranged. The way the furniture was positioned, as if waiting for occupants who might return at any moment. Interesting, she murmured, examining the family photographs on the mantelpiece. She's created a shrine to her lost family. The dining room table set for 4, the children's bedrooms maintained exactly as they were. It's a form of magical thinking. If she keeps everything the same, maybe they'll come back. I watched her handle the same photograph that had disturbed me the day before, but she showed no reaction to it. To her, it was just a picture of a family that no longer existed, nothing more supernatural than the memories of loss and love that every old house contains. We spent an hour going through the rooms, Dr. Chen taking notes and asking questions about Clara's mental state, her isolation from family and friends, her refusal to accept help from social services. Everything had a rational explanation when filtered through her professional expertise. The house was just a house, filled with the accumulated weight of one woman's inability to let go of the past. But as we climbed the stairs to the second floor, I felt that familiar prickle of unease. The air seemed thicker up here, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Dr. Chen noticed my discomfort. Anxiety response, she said matter-of-factly. The upper floors of old houses often feel more oppressive because of poor ventilation and the way sound carries. Your subconscious is picking up on environmental factors that your conscious mind interprets as supernatural. She was probably right, but when we reached the children's bedroom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The dust on the floor had been disturbed since my last visit. Not just the footprints I'd seen before, but new ones, as if someone had been walking around the room in the hours since I'd fled the house. Did you notice anything unusual when you were here yesterday? Dr. Chen asked, and I realized she was staring at the same footprints. Yes, I said, not trusting my voice to remain steady. But I thought I'd imagined it. She knelt down, examining the prints more closely. They were small, definitely made by a child, and they led from the bed to the closet and back again. But what made them truly disturbing was that they were layered. Some older and partially obscured by dust, others fresh and clear, as if someone had been walking the same path repeatedly over a long period of time. These are recent, Dr. Chen said, her professional composure cracking slightly. Someone has been in this room. But even as she spoke, we both knew that wasn't possible. The house had been empty for weeks. The doors and windows were all locked. There was no sign of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been inside except for us. We were still staring at the footprints when we heard it. The sound of a door closing somewhere downstairs. Not a slam, just the soft click of a door being shut by someone trying not to make noise. Dr. Chen and I looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in her eyes. Someone else was in the house. Someone who had been upstairs while we were downstairs. Someone who was now trying to move around without being detected. "Stay behind me," she whispered, and I realized she was taking charge of the situation with the same authority she'd shown in the classroom. But her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone to call the police. We crept down the stairs, listening for any sound that might indicate where the intruder had gone. The house was silent except for the normal settling noises of old wood and the distant hum of traffic. But the front door, which I was certain we'd left unlocked, was now standing wide open. Dr. Chen called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Hello? Is someone there? We're calling the police." No response, but as we moved through the house, checking each room systematically, I noticed that things had been moved. The dining room chairs were no longer perfectly aligned. One of the photographs on the mantelpiece had been turned to face the wall. The kitchen drawers were open, as if someone had been searching for something. "Whoever was here is gone now," Dr. Chen said, but she kept her phone ready to dial 911. "We should leave and come back with the police." But I was staring at the kitchen table, where something new had appeared. A drawing done in crayon on construction paper, showing a house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it. A man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in the uncertain handwriting of a young child, were the words, "My family." The paper was worn to the touch, and the crayon marks looked fresh, as if someone had just finished drawing it. "Dr. Chen," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Look at this." She examined the drawing, her scientific training warring with the evidence in front of her. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Children don't break into houses to leave artwork." But even as she spoke, I could see her reconsidering everything she'd observed. The footprints, the moved objects, the drawing that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. None of it fit with her clinical understanding of grief hallucinations. "We need to leave," she said finally. "Now." But as we headed for the door, I heard something that made me stop. Children's voices coming from upstairs. Not laughter this time, but conversation. 2 kids talking to each other in the way siblings do, casual and comfortable and completely at ease. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Dr. Chen nodded, her face pale. "We need to go, right now." But I found myself moving toward the stairs instead of the door, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out words. "She's here again," one of them said. A girl's voice, maybe 10 years old. "I know," replied a boy, younger. "Do you think she'll stay this time?" "I hope so," the girl said. "It's been so lonely without Mama." Dr. Chen grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. "We're leaving, now." But I couldn't move, because I understood, suddenly, what was happening. The children weren't haunting the house. They were trying to communicate with the living world, trying to reach out to anyone who might listen. And Clara had been listening for 15 years, setting tables for a family that existed in the spaces between life and death. "They're not dangerous," I said, though I wasn't sure how I knew that. "They're just lost." "Lost or not, this isn't natural," Dr. Chen said, "and I'm not equipped to deal with whatever this is." She was right, of course, but as we left the house, locking the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was abandoning something important. The children's voices had sounded so hopeful, so desperate for connection. And the drawing on the kitchen table had been signed with 2 names, Michael and Sarah. the same names I had found in the newspaper articles about the fire. I returned to the house alone 3 days later, against Dr. Chen's advice and my own better judgment. She'd spent hours trying to convince me that what we'd experienced was a shared hallucination, a psychological phenomenon where one person's expectations influence another's perceptions. But I couldn't forget the warmth of the crayon drawing, the clarity of the children's voices, the way the footprints had appeared in dust that hadn't been disturbed for years. The house felt different this time, expectant, like it had been waiting for me to come back. I'd brought supplies, a camping chair, a thermos of coffee, a digital recorder, and a camera. If I was going to document whatever was happening here, I wanted to do it properly. But more than that, I wanted to understand what Clara had lived with for 15 years, why she'd chosen to remain in a house that most people would have abandoned. The family photograph on the mantelpiece was no longer cracked. The glass was perfectly clear, and the children's faces looked more distinct than they had before. Michael and Sarah, 8 and 10, smiling at the camera with the unconscious joy of kids who'd never imagined their lives could end so abruptly. I set up the recording equipment in the living room and sat down to wait. The afternoon light streaming through the windows was warm and golden, and for a moment, the house felt like any other old Victorian, full of character and history, but fundamentally normal. Then I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully to avoid making noise. I checked the recorder to make sure it was working, then called out softly. "Hello? Michael? Sarah? I'm here to listen if you want to talk." The footsteps stopped. The house held its breath. "My name is David," I continued. "I'm Clara's nephew. I know about the fire, about what happened to your family. I know you've been trying to reach out." A long silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, a girl's voice from the top of the stairs. "Are you going to stay?" I looked up but saw nothing except shadows and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm trying to understand what's happening here." "Mama stayed," the voice said, closer now. "She stayed and talked to us and set the table for dinner, but then she went away too." The sadness in those words made my chest tight. "She didn't want to leave you," I said. "She loved you very much." "We know." This was the boy's voice, younger and more hesitant. "But she was sad all the time. We tried to make her happy, but we couldn't remember how." I felt something brush against my shoulder, light as a butterfly landing. When I turned, I saw nothing, but the air shimmered slightly, as if heat waves were rising from the floor. "What do you remember?" I asked. "Playing," Sarah said. "Hide and seek, reading books, Daddy helping with homework." Her voice was growing stronger, more confident. And then the smoke came, and everything went dark. "We tried to get out," Michael added, "but the hallway was too hot, and we couldn't breathe. Daddy came to get us, but then he couldn't breathe either. And then we were here," Sarah said, "but different, like we were watching everything from far away. We could see Mama crying, but we couldn't touch her. We could hear her calling our names, but when we answered, she couldn't hear us back." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I listened to these children describe their deaths with the matter-of-fact acceptance that only kids possess. They'd been trapped in this house for 15 years, trying to communicate with a mother who was slowly losing her mind from grief. "Why can't you leave?" I asked. "We don't know how," Michael said. "This is where we lived. This is where we died. We're part of the house now." "But maybe we could learn," Sarah added, and I could hear hope in her voice. "If someone taught us." That's when I understood what Clara had been trying to do. She hadn't been clinging to the past. She'd been trying to help her children move on, to find whatever peace was available to them. But her own grief had been too overwhelming. her guilt too consuming. She'd become trapped in the house along with them, unable to let go and unable to help them find their way forward. "I want to help," I said, "but I don't know how." "We think we know," Sarah said, "but we need someone who can hear us, someone who can help us remember." Over the next several hours, as the sun set and the house filled with shadows, Michael and Sarah told me their story. Not the clinical facts I'd found in newspaper articles, but the lived experience of a family that had been happy and whole until a single night changed everything. They told me about the bedtime stories their father read to them, about the way their mother hummed while she cooked dinner, about the games they played in the backyard, and the dreams they'd had for the future. Michael had wanted to be an astronaut. Sarah had wanted to be a veterinarian. Normal childhood dreams that had been cut short by faulty wiring and an old house that had become a trap. But they also told me about the 15 years since their deaths, about watching their mother retreat into isolation and grief, about trying desperately to let her know they were still there, still loved her, still needed her to be okay. She stopped eating, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Stopped sleeping. We tried to make her happy, but everything we did just made her sadder. We moved things around, Michael added. Toys, pictures, anything that might remind her of good times. But she thought it meant we were angry, that we were hunting her. We weren't haunting her, they said together. We were trying to take care of her. As the night deepened, I began to understand what they needed. Not exorcism or banishment, but acknowledgement. Recognition that their love for their mother had survived death, that their presence in the house wasn't malevolent, but protective. They'd been trying to guard Clara from the worst of her depression, to remind her that she was still loved, still needed to take care of herself. "She's gone now," I said gently. "She died 3 weeks ago. But she's with your father now, and she's not in pain anymore." A long silence, then Michael asked, "Does that mean we can go too?" "I think so," I said, "but only if you want to." "We want to," Sarah said. "We've been waiting so long to see them again. But we were afraid to leave Mama alone." "She's not alone anymore," I said. "She's with the people who love her." I felt the air in the room shift, growing lighter somehow. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the house for 15 years was lifting, replaced by something that felt like relief. "Thank you," both children said, their voices already growing fainter. "Thank you for listening." The house settled into a silence that felt different from the dead quiet I'd experienced before. This was peaceful, restful, like the silence that follows the end of a long, difficult conversation. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, dozing fitfully in the camping chair. When I woke at dawn, the house felt empty in a way it hadn't since I'd first walked through the door. Not abandoned, but complete. Like a story that had finally found its ending. The family photograph on the mantelpiece was gone. In its place was a note, written in Clara's careful handwriting. "Thank you for helping them find their way home. The house is yours now, but it's free of the past. Do with it what you think best. Clara." I sold the house 3 months later to a young family with 2 children. The Johnsons were first-time homebuyers, drawn by the Victorian architecture and the large lot that would give their kids plenty of space to play. They loved the original heartwood floors, the detailed molding, and the way the afternoon light streamed through the tall windows. I told them about the fire, about the family that had died there in 2009. Honesty seemed important, and they deserved to know the house's history. But I also told them about the restoration, about how Clara had rebuilt it exactly as it had been, putting love and care into every detail. "Houses hold memories," Mrs. Johnson said as we walked through the empty rooms. "But they also hold the potential for new memories. This feels like a place where children can be happy." She was right. The house felt welcoming now, ready for new life and new stories. The oppressive weight that had made it feel like a tomb had lifted completely, replaced by the kind of peace that comes from closure. I used the money from the sale to pay off my debts and put a down payment on a small apartment across town. But I kept one thing from Clara's house, a single photograph I'd found tucked into her journal. It showed the four of them in the backyard, not posing for the camera, but caught in a moment of pure joy. James was pushing Michael on a swing, while Clara and Sarah worked in the garden. All of them were laughing, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of being together. It was the kind of photograph that captured what family really meant. Not just genetics or shared living space, but the bonds of love that transcend even death. I had it framed and placed it on my mantelpiece, not as a shrine to tragedy, but as a reminder that love persists even in the face of unimaginable loss. Dr. Chen called me a few weeks after the sale was finalized. She'd been researching similar cases, trying to understand what we'd experienced in the house. Her scientific mind still struggled with what couldn't be explained through conventional psychology, but she'd found enough documentation of similar phenomena to accept that some experiences exist beyond our current understanding. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me during our phone conversation, about the children not haunting the house but trying to protect their mother. It changes how I think about grief, about the ways love continues even after death. I agreed. What I'd witnessed in that house wasn't supernatural horror. It was supernatural love. A family so devoted to each other that not even death could break their bonds. Michael and Sarah had spent 15 years trying to comfort their grieving mother, to let her know she wasn't alone. And when they finally understood that their presence was causing her more pain than comfort, they'd waited for someone who could help them let go. 6 months after the sale, I drove past the house one evening. The Johnsons had painted the shutters a cheerful blue and planted flowers in the front garden. Children's bicycles were scattered on the lawn, and I could see warm light glowing from the windows. It looked like a home again, not a museum of grief. As I sat in my car, watching the family move around inside their house, I thought I saw something that made me smile. 2 figures in one of the upstairs windows, just for a moment, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a boy and a girl watching over the new children who now called this place home. But this time, instead of sadness or fear, I felt only peace. Michael and Sarah weren't trapped anymore. They'd found their way to whatever comes after, reunited with their parents in a place where love doesn't end with death. Yet somehow I believed they still watched over the house they'd once called home, making sure it remained a place where families could flourish. The Johnsons never reported any unusual activity. Their children played in the same rooms where Michael and Sarah had once lived, but they played without fear, without the oppressive weight of unresolved grief. The house had been healed, its dark history transformed into something that felt more like a blessing than a curse. Sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, I would think about Clara and the 15 years she'd spent trying to help her children find peace. She'd been driven to isolation by her guilt and grief, but she'd never stopped loving them, never stopped trying to take care of them. In the end, that love had been enough to bridge the gap between life and death, to create a connection that transcended the boundaries of the physical world. The house on Elm Street taught me that death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's just a transition, a doorway to something we can't yet understand. And sometimes love is strong enough to hold that door open just long enough for the living and the dead to find their way to peace. I never went back to the house after that evening. I didn't need to. The story was complete, the circle closed, the Hendricks family was together again, and the house they'd loved so much was once again filled with the laughter of children. But I kept their photograph on my mantelpiece, a reminder that some stories don't end with death. They just find new ways to continue. And whenever I look at that image of a family caught in a moment of perfect happiness, I remember that love, true love, is the one force in this world that death cannot touch. The mourning house had finally learned to live again.